Analyst, journalist, and author Danny Haiphong joins us on the bridge to China. Hey everyone, I'm Jason Smith, originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today's guest, Danny Haiphong, is host of the popular geopolitics YouTube channel under the same name. Welcome back to the bridge to China, Danny.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jason. It's good to be back with you.
I'm so delighted to have you. You're incredibly popular, and we want to get some of your analytical insights into what's going on in the world. Recently, President Xi Jinping and President Trump met in South Korea and had a relative cool down of the current trade war. But it looks like China does still hold all the cards, or at least makes the cards. What are the risks for the U.S. Department of War if rare earths supply deal falls apart after 1 year suspension, because it's supposed to be renewed each year? Can the U.S. catch up in the short term, or does the U.S. still need China?
No, there's not going to be any catching up. It's the processing and refining that's such a big issue when it comes to rare earth minerals. All of the companies that do it are in China, and in order to make processing and refining happen, it's all going to be from scratch. And the United States is not really well known in the world, especially for the last several decades, of being able to produce anything very quickly. There's a lot of, unlike China, there's a lot of limitations to what capital, mainly being private, what it is willing to dish out in terms of infrastructure development, and then what the U.S. government is willing to fund in order to make that happen. And then the countries like Thailand and others and Malaysia, I believe, or is it Myanmar, one of them, that has made deals with the United States around rare earths. That kind of cooperation is not going to be as smooth as it looks on paper. It'll take a lot of time. It's going to take probably many years for them to build any processing and refining capacity for their rare earths. And so what ultimately is likely to happen is that the United States is going to continuously, every single year, at least for as long as the Trump administration is in office and willing to go by its own its own framework that it agreed upon with China, is going to have to renew that for the time being, probably indefinitely. But there's also this question of whether the Trump administration is capable of keeping to an agreement or a deal. How many times since the Trump administration was reelected has it used deals to simply go on a different trajectory that contradicts these deals, rip them up, and then ultimately go along with a status quo that favors more hostilities and tensions and push toward war? Literally, the Trump administration right now is saying, let's talk to maybe I'll talk to Nicolas Maduro, and that would be great. But the fact of the matter is the United States is waging covert operations, the CIA is, to try to overthrow that government. And maybe, just maybe, we'll conduct land strikes to facilitate that destruction of that country militarily. So really, and then we saw with Iran back in June, right? How many months and months was Trump wagging his finger saying, no nuclear enrichment, oh, we're going to negotiate, and then Israel does its strike. There's 12 days of war, and the United States bombs Iran, and suddenly we see that diplomacy for the Trump administration tends to not really have much credibility. So China is likely aware of this. Likely it is aware of this. And I believe that's also a major reason why China didn't come in saying we want to push a kind of maximalist agenda for us and get you to agree to some major trade agreement that favors us, because I think China came in knowing we're going to use the leverage that we have to get back to a status quo we can live with, because the Trump administration, the U.S. as a whole, it's kind of a basket case. It can't be trusted. There has to be this constant supervision. Even I remember reading the Global Times after this happened, and the analysis was, well, the United States kind of needs to be almost like babied through this process, because at any moment it could throw a tantrum and blow it all up. So China really came in as almost a supervisor of the world economic order as it exists with any stability whatsoever. That China is the force that can bring that, and came in as a supervisor of, well, you did a lot of bad things, child. Now you need to come back down to earth and come back to a place that we can live with at this time. So the rare earths, if this falls through, the United States will be in the same exact position it was when the Trump administration went maximalist on its trade war with China. It'll be in a position where it's going to be in a lot of trouble around all of the economic and military goods the U.S. needs to keep its empire going. That will come under great risk. And it isn't as if there aren't many areas of the U.S. economy right now that are very sensitive, which could lead to a recession or worse. So it's not a good position for the U.S. to be in. China does hold all the cards, and China's not the one who's going to be panicking about any of this. It's the U.S. that's going to have to look over its shoulder under the Trump administration, wondering what should it do? Should it continue to provoke, or should it actually just follow the letter of the law that it agreed to in South Korea? Unfortunately, I think the answer is not the one that rational-minded people who are interested, even self-interested, would abide by, because that's just not how the U.S. system works.
One of the things, obviously, we both know, everyone knows, is that the U.S. likes to create enemies, boogeymen, for the purpose of increasing its military budget. We spend $1 trillion a year now on the U.S. military. A lot of the people in the Trump administration, around the Trump administration, associated with the Pentagon, like to say that China wants to dominate the world. I saw a Bloomberg headline today that said China has a ring of ports around the world. And so that's supposed to scare us, I suppose. In your assessment, as someone who visits China often and studies China, does China seek to dominate the world?
It's an interesting question, because all of the evidence suggests absolutely not. China actually talks a lot about, its major scholars talk about Thucydides' trap, right? If the United States is an empire, if the United States is an empire in decline and collapse, then is China just going to essentially fall into the same trap and become exactly that? Because that's what made the U.S. powerful for so long. And the overall consensus answer is no. The United States is not, China is not going to fall into Thucydides' trap. It's going to pursue its own path. And we see that happening already. Now, the problem, though, is not so much that China is not going to fall into the U.S.'s trap, or the Thucydides trap, or repeating the mistakes of history. The problem is that China's rise is incompatible with the system that's in decline. So if the system in the United States is what it is, which is an empire, which is dominated by banks, Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, military contractors that profit from war, if it's dominated by strictly monopoly capital and those that seek to make as much money for themselves as possible, then China's system poses a big problem, because its sheer development creates an alternative for itself and for the world that doesn't have to depend on the U.S.'s dollar system. It doesn't have to depend on U.S. capital. It doesn't have to depend on the U.S. military or U.S. Political domination or anything like that to exist, survive, and thrive. And so this is the big issue here. The big issue is that because China is not going to fall into Thucydides' trap, because it isn't, we see the proof, the evidence of this. We see how sovereign China is. We see how its development is an economic miracle already. And we see the trajectory is upwards. Goldman Sachs is saying China's going to grow at 6% in the next year, despite the fact that the world economy is sluggish and the U.S. is tearing it down and pulling it back with stagnation and inflation and tariffs and economic war. Despite all of this, despite all the instability the U.S. empire has caused, China continues forward on its trajectory of advancing development and doing so in a way that doesn't rely on the mechanisms that monopoly capital, finance, banks, military industrialists that they so desperately want the world to be subjected to. This is the big problem. This is why it's not really about China wanting dominance at all. It's that China will just be dominant in its own way. It's not dominant over people, over nations, over the rest of the world. It's dominant in the areas of development that really make a difference in people's lives, and also are what a vision of what strength and sovereignty and power can look like, which doesn't have to or doesn't lead to at all a scenario where we fear for nuclear war, or we fear for World War III, or we fear for regime change, or we fear violence and catastrophe and the suppression of civil liberties and racism and all of these things, genocide, all of this. We don't. It's a rise that gives way to the possibilities where that those things aren't necessary. It's outmoding them, and that is the big problem. That is what worries the United States' establishment so much.
You know, a lot of analysts are having a major debate about the intention of the United States towards China. Some are saying that the U.S. is pivoting away from China to focus on the Americas. And others are warning that nothing has changed and the United States is very much still overtly hostile to China. We recently saw the incoming government in Japan become involved in China's internal civil war over Taiwan again. And there's also, in the last few days, a sale of a $900 million new sale of weapons to Taiwan by the United States. In your opinion, is the United States seeking to agitate China using Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, or is China is in fact the United States shifting away from China?
Well, I think the evidence is that yes, these we can't call them all countries because Taiwan is not a country, but it is a part of China. But the U.S. seeks to use any proxy force, any force in the region that will work against China. And it's interesting. There was this report, this Rand Corporation report, that some highlighted as a possibility that there is going to be a retreat so much, or a retreat with China, that there will be a kind of stabilization of this rivalry. And this report warned, this happened earlier in the fall of 2025, it warned that there's disastrous consequences for the United States being so hostile to China. The problem is that this report didn't even last on the Rand Corporation website, this publication, for a couple of months. It is now withdrawn and says it is under review. And all of the developments of late, whether it's Lai Ching-te, he just agreed to spend $40 billion US on U.S. contracts, military contracts, to fortify its so-called defense against China, using language that was really provocative in the sense that it talked about national defense, which is just absolutely ridiculous since Taiwan, it comes under the one China policy. But this is the kind of language and the rhetoric that is feeding the U.S.'s ability to interfere and to militarize Taiwan. And then, of course, Japan, Takaichi making those remarks that anger China so much, saying that Japan would intervene possibly in a conflict between China and Taiwan. All of this would not be possible if the United States were not, if we controlled for the U.S., the U.S. wasn't a factor, then we would have a much different scenario. There would be no force that could stand behind them to push them into this. Japan, of course, doesn't need any, has a long history of committing imperial crimes and genocide, etc., against Chinese people. But the fact of the matter is that those days where Japan can do that with any level of dictation and power, those days are long over. They were defeated. And it is only with the U.S.'s occupation of Japan that allows for the further occupation of Japan to Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, like that scenario is only made possible by the U.S. So these countries, these entities, they are supposed to form the basis of a future war with China for the United States. The problem is that there is no force or alliance, quote unquote, out there strong enough to prevent China's rise. So a war utilizing the Philippines or Japan would end disastrously for them and the world. So this is the big problem. Again, we run into a major contradiction that cannot be resolved, which is, yes, the U.S. would, it's in their doctrine, it's in their foreign policy. We haven't yet seen Trump's new so-called national security strategy. You know, from the prior to, China and the containment of China was a major priority. Strategic competition, great power competition, whatever it's called, weakening China was a major priority. But every mechanism and means to weaken China doesn't work very well. Economically, trying to weaken China blows back and backfires hard on the United States. Militarily, well, China is strong enough and has an advanced enough military to defend itself, so you can't really go that far there without bringing upon major pain to yourself. This is why there was a report written in the RAND Corporation that maybe this needs to be paused for a bit while we figure things out. Well, can't even have that. So this is a major crisis for the U.S. establishment, for the elites, the so-called deep state. They are in a panic. It's a kind of a silent panic because they know that this is really a reflection of the larger problem here, that the U.S. power projection, its empire, all of it, does not have the ability to really dictate terms. Not even that resolution, which everyone was debating, 2803, everyone's debating Trump's so-called peace plan. Not even that does the U.S. have the ability to dictate terms, because once, even in a place like Gaza, blown up, torn up, a concentration camp, subject to the most genocidal, monstrous, heinous war crimes that we've seen in several generations, maybe ever. Despite all of that, the resistance in Palestine is the most popular force in Gaza. So to expect that the United States is going to trounce in there with Saudi, Jordanian, Turkish, whatever, regional forces to act as some kind of neo-colonial shock troop dictatorship is ludicrous. Well, you're just going to have more fighting. And that means that the U.S. it doesn't even have the ability to dictate terms there. It couldn't dictate terms to Iran. Iran still has a nuclear program. Its missile system, its ballistic missile system, showed pretty well against Israel, to the point where Israel was the one who had to tap out. There's really no Ukraine. It can't win in Ukraine. It can't finish the job in Ukraine because Russia's the one actually finishing the job toward its own aims. All of this, it's all a reflection of the same phenomenon, a collapse, a decline in the U.S. empire's ability to project power, which makes it all the more dangerous because those who rule, the deep state, the military-industrial complex, the banks, when they panic, they don't retreat. They'll take off a RAND Corporation paper before they retreat. What they do is they double down, they triple down, they find stranger, even more brutal ways, as we saw in Gaza over the last couple of years, to try to enforce their rule. And that's what we can expect. So, yeah, these Japan, we should expect more people like Takaichi to emerge out of Japan. We should expect people like Marco Jr., the son of the horrific U.S.-backed dictator there. We should expect more people like that to emerge out of any country or entity that the U.S. is trying to manipulate into war. Because the more desperate it gets, the more extreme it gets, and it's going to continue to slap us in the face because the days where the empire can hide and you can put on a mask and say it's benevolent, it can save the world, it can bring democracy, I mean, those days are long gone.
I want to talk about what threat China poses to the United States. There's a huge debate emerging, and this has been kind of in the background for years. What is China's economy, right? A lot of people say, oh, it turned capitalist. Oh, it's still communist. Oh, it's market socialism. All of these things, whatever it is, it absolutely seems to be terrifying people in Washington, D.C. So why is it that China poses this existential threat to the United States, or to those governing the United States?
Yeah, it's a huge question. It goes to very, I think, surface level reasons. I think a major surface level reason is that China, being what it is, being a country that's on the rise economically, being that it has capabilities now economically and militarily that rival the United States. This is just looking at it from the perspective of how the Pentagon, how the think tanks, how they look at it. What they see is an economic and political order in China that's on the rise, and their viewpoint of it is that, oh no, the authoritarian dictatorship is coming for the Western way of life, that democracy is under threat. And in many ways, that fear is justified, not in the content, but in the fact that there actually is a major rejection worldwide of the Western way of life. But it's not the rejection that they're telling us it is. The rejection actually is one of the complete and utter failure of what it tells us is that there's been a complete and utter failure and just a hypocritical explosion of disasters which have proven to much of the world that there needs to be something different. And China is the embodiment of this as the most successful economic and political project of the multipolar world, a world where other ways of development and ways of governing politically and economically a country can arise and bring about possible alternatives to prosper and to bring about a more peaceful world. That's the surface level. The underneath all of that is the fact that China's way of life, the way it organizes its system specifically as what they call Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, that is really the big problem. Even in the 1990s under Bubba Clinton, under Bill Clinton, they were talking about the problems of the Chinese model. This was during the wild 90s. China was integrating hard into the world economy. It was undergoing major structural reforms to ensure that it could liberate the productive forces, integrate private capital into its innovation and its development. And not any of this could convince the United States that a country led by a communist party is worth sticking to if it gets too strong. And that's what's happened, is that China is no longer a low-wage country that can service a particular priority for the U.S., which is cheap labor for low value-added goods. Now China produces high value-added goods, the highest of technology, the most quality of infrastructure, and it's led by a communist party which has aims that are fundamentally antagonistic to the U.S.'s aims. So the Communist Party of China wants to eliminate poverty in China. It wants to get to a modern socialist country by 2050. It wants to ensure a truly peaceful order, one that respects the core principles of international law, especially self-determination. That is anathema to what the United States political class and establishment and elites want. The monopolies, the cartels, the banks, the military-industrial complex, they want a world where they can rob, loot, plunder, make as much money as they can, and just ruin the world. It doesn't matter what happens. That is the priority for them. And China is the biggest obstacle in the way of that, because it has succeeded to the point where, yes, it is a real threat. All of this hand-wringing and this bashing that happens from China hawks and talking heads and all of this, whether it's on social media or in the Western mainstream media or even in the halls of government, all of it is just obfuscation, projection. It's fear. It's the true fear of what it means for the goal of the first Cold War, which was the elimination of communism, of any society governed by a party led by communists and socialists. That fantasy and illusion that they could eliminate that is coming back to haunt them. The more that China becomes stronger, the more it leads the world in more and more areas of development, and the more that the rest of the world embraces China as a partner and a friend. This is what really, really, really scares the United States. This is what makes China an actual threat from an objective standpoint, in the sense that if China continues on with the Belt and Road Initiative, if China becomes a more powerful economic player, if China succeeds in its own goals for itself, then all of that just puts under a huge microscope the failures, the contradictions, and the horrors of an empire that's on the back foot, and a system of capital that's on the back foot that can't possibly compete. So this is the big threat. This is the big fear. And the only option that many see is an eventual war. There's a lot of disagreement on how quick that should be and how that should happen. But ultimately, there are many in the elite brass that say war is the only answer.
Well, does China's ability to stand down the U.S. in its trade war, because it does look like China makes the cards. I mean, that's the outcome that we're looking at in terms of China has the ability to withhold inputs for U.S. manufacturing, especially for that of the Pentagon, that prevent them from continuing to rattle sabers in the trade war against China. Does that extend to other nations? Will China be able to shield developing nations from Trump's trade war against the world? Is this inherently anti-imperial? Is this the beginning of a real, true multipolar world?
I think the answer to this question is yes and no. Because China, when it comes to, like, for example, being anti-imperialist, China in principles and its actions is to the point that it can be under current circumstances. So, in terms of a framework for looking at this, it's China and the rest of the world. We live in a reality that is undergirded by the dominance of and the preeminence especially for the last 70 years, but really for hundreds of years. The dominant world system has been one of private capital and empire, imperialism, whether it's a long time ago, the Spanish, the British, etc., or whether it's the U.S. over the last 70 plus years. One that is dominated by finance and the U.S. dollar, which has wrapped much of the world economy in its tentacles. And so that creates inherent limitations for anyone, one country especially, to overcome. So in the sense that China has been able to succeed in this economic miracle to become the largest economy in purchasing power parity terms, and to really be the leader, the economic engine of these multilateral, multipolar institutions, its own, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative has created massive changes for people all over the world, from Pakistan to all over the African continent, to all over Asia. Countries have really benefited from this, and that has trickled down to ordinary people to be able to have a high-speed rail, to be able to have a metro system, to be able to have key infrastructure that provides jobs and then makes it easier to conduct commerce and development in its own right, which has a cascading effect. To have access to 5G technology, to have access to the latest, highest of technologies within reason for that country's development level. All of that it makes just huge inroads in a country's ability to prosper and to be part of a multipolar world, and to protect itself from the U.S.'s, for example, addiction to economic warfare. And we've seen from Trump's attempt to tariff the entire world that there are many, even Canada, there are many countries that are just willing to say, okay, well, if you're going to hit us, then we'll just go to China for varying needs, because now China has a supply chain and an industrial capacity to provide a market that we might need. So all this to say is that yes, China does have this capacity. Without China, for example, Russia, Iran, they would be in a lot more dire straits. Those sanctions would be far more difficult to to be effective. I mean, it would be. I mean, they would be far more difficult to subvert and to survive under. There's even like these cascading consequences, right? Everyone knows that Iran is the biggest national actor that supports Palestine. That the resistance, both in Palestine and in the region, would be far weaker, far less capable if it wasn't for the diplomatic, military, and economic support that Iran provides. Well, if China didn't purchase 80+% of Iran's energy, oil, for example, Iran would have a really difficult time doing anything other than trying not to economically collapse. I mean, this is just the reality of the situation. It's China's adherence to the principles that sanctions are illegal that allow it to say, no, we're not going to listen to the U.S. or the UN or the EU or whoever it is leveling sanctions on a country. We're going to still trade with it. So, yeah, in that capacity, definitely, China does offer this critical protection and defense against the excesses and the effectiveness of the empire's economic, military predations. But no, it cannot ultimately be the, let's say, like the savior of the rest of the world, because one, China is still a developing country in its own right. China has to prioritize a population of 1.4 billion people and the development needs that they have. It's only 70 plus years into a process of its own sovereignty. Its rapid development is a miracle, but there's so many areas in China that need to continue to develop. There's still relative poverty. There's still low incomes for many people. There's still a difference between how people in the rural areas live versus the cities. There's still all of these kinds of issues that need to be. There's still corruption, even though they've come really hard down on that, especially in the local areas, local governments. But it's not like that anti-corruption campaign has ended. It's not like poverty alleviation campaign has ended. These are things that are ongoing, and China can't abandon them for even more extensive global pursuits. And then there's the fact that China's foreign policy is very specific and it's very concrete. And it's one that lends itself to a powerful example, but with the need for people to have expectations that aren't fantastical or even mythological, because I don't really know of an example of a country that just goes around and liberates everybody from their from their oppression, from their disasters. It doesn't really work that way. It can't work that way. There's that famous Che quote, make 1, 2, 3 Vietnams. But he wasn't talking about Cuba going out and making 1, 2, 3 Vietnams. He was talking about Vietnam doing that and everybody else, Vietnam liberating itself from the French colonial empire, from the British, Japanese aligned incursions, the U.S. then, the U.S. being the longest purveyor of violence and an attempt to subordinate Vietnam. He was talking about that, the Vietnamese people doing it and everybody else doing it. So it always takes, in the development of the multipolar world, it's going to take everybody in the global south. It's going to take everybody who wants to see a new system to build that for themselves. Like, they're going to have to win that. That's not always going to be easy. But China, certainly, its foreign policy is non-interference. Its foreign policy is strictly non-interference, meaning you're never going to see China aid a political entity outright, at least publicly. There will never be a paper trail where you can say China supports this party, let's say in the Philippines, against this one because it wants to see that party in power, even if it's in China's best interests, right? Even if that party would be far better for the world, it won't do it because non-interference is strictly its policy, because it has its own development needs, and it has learned from the lessons even of the Soviet Union, which practiced realpolitik all the time out of mostly necessity, and some out of ideology, depending on the period. But the reality is that the lessons of the Soviet Union's attempt to bolster the socialist government in Afghanistan really sent shockwaves across the world, because the United States used that as an opportunity to bog the Soviet Union down and to objectively weaken it. Now, it wasn't the thing that led to the Soviet Union's ultimate collapse entirely, but it played a role. And when China saw that, it said, okay, we can't do that. In the state we're in, we can't do that, especially after the Soviet Union fell and the bloc of countries that could call themselves socialists essentially disintegrated into a handful at very low development levels. And so that's why we have multipolarity. We don't have a Cold War socialism versus capitalism right now, is because the world that came after 1991 was dominated by global capital. It was dominated by the West. It was the end of history. It was the U.S.'s time to shine, meaning it was going to bludgeon and destroy the entire world for itself so it could be dominant forever. And China said, no, we're going to bide our time, and we're going to develop, and we're going to take care of what we need to take care of. And we're going to adopt a foreign policy that is in line with international law, that follows the principles of self-determination, but it's going to be very strictly non-interference, because China needs to take care of China first. And that is what we have. It doesn't mean that China's not concerned with issues of human rights, of wars. China just plays the role it can play under the current circumstances. For some, that's not good enough, especially in the collective West and in the United States, who see the need for a really powerful adversary, a really powerful intervention against the U.S. empire. But the fact of the matter is that you're never going to see China do that, because there are consequences. And ultimately, the consequences of what we might think and we fantasize in our heads as being best for everybody might actually be not best for nobody. It might actually just harm everybody and everything, and we would have a much worse outcome. So that is, I think, strategically how China navigates things. So yes, China provides such an incredibly important bulwark against the advancement of U.S. empire. And no, yeah, it can't destroy the U.S. empire on its own, and it won't. It doesn't even have the aim to do that, because it's just not a position that anyone who's thinking about the aims that China's thinking about makes any sense at all. For us in the U.S., we're just like, oh my God. So many people just want this to end. They want the suffering. They want the powerlessness to end. But really, that's up to us. That's really up to how people who are governed by these megalomaniacal, profiteering, sadistic, and absolutely evil elites. That is up to us. We got to take care of that. And then the opportunities when we develop and have the power to develop a system that's just and able to eradicate these social ills and this warmongering exploitation, then the possibilities are endless. And that's how I believe we should look at it. We should look at China's approach as a great example, as one that, yeah, it can't ruin and destroy the empire all on its own. It doesn't even try to. But it provides this very valuable service to humanity that now we have a responsibility to advance in our own right. And obviously our task is far different.
Your use of Afghanistan in this context is novel to me, and I think that really says a lot about, why the leadership in China has chosen this non-interference policy, because wow. I mean, that's really enlightening. It's going to affect my thinking going forward about the way that China does things. Thank you so much for that insight. I'd like to talk about other powers, because it does look like the United States, it used to be the United States and Africa saying you have to choose. And now it's come to Europe. The United States is like, hey, Europe, you have to choose, and they're like, you either have to trade with us or you have to trade with China. And Europe looks like it is to some extent choosing its own path, despite having signed a very unadvantageous trade deal with the United States. How do you think China's diplomacy with Western European countries, or just the EU in general, might serve as a bridge for broader movements away from an imperial Western order and towards multipolarity? Is there an opportunity for European countries to choose a different path?
Well, China offers it. China all the time, whether it's France during this infamous Xi-Macron meeting, during the Biden era, whether it's dealings with Germany, or even this recent spat around tech with the Netherlands. I mean, in all cases, China has a very strict position, which is strategic autonomy. It says, Europe, you can be strategically autonomous. We actually want that for you. It's almost like when you are when you have a friend who's addicted to some kind of substance, to drugs or alcohol, and you say to them, we really would love a better life for you, but it's really up to you. You have to want that better life. China says this all the time to Europe. It says, all you need to do is think for yourselves, act for yourselves, look at yourselves in the mirror and say, I want something better for us. I do not want to be a U.S. lapdog, which only maybe serves my career for a specific period of time, but makes life hell, actually weakens Europe objectively in all realms, industrially, economically, financially, politically, diplomatically, militarily, all realms. Europe just gets weaker and weaker and weaker under U.S. diktats. So China says, all you've got to do is have better relationships with a country like us, because we are not going to tell you how you should do things. We have all of these great things that your societies want, could use. We have all these electric vehicles, renewable energy products. We have all of these markets where you can sell your goods. People will buy them because they have money in their pockets. But ultimately, they are on a very tight and suffocating U.S. leash that a lot of these leaders are just more than willing to go along with. So China offers the opportunity all of the time, but while it offers this opportunity, it does not grovel for that. How many times have we seen in recent years where European leaders like Ursula von der Leyen or Annalena Baerbock, for example, how many times have they gone to China and have not been given a red carpet, have not been greeted on the most warm and celebratory terms? No, China just treats them like any other country, actually far below those countries that they have real strategic partnerships with and real deep friendships with. Eritrea, Venezuela, their leaders will get red carpets. They will get the whole thing. They will have the military demonstrations and all of that for them, because those countries are strategically autonomous and they're willing to provide mutual benefits for China and themselves in that relationship without any coercion and without any shirking of responsibilities. No, these countries see a huge opportunity in China's economic miracle, and vice versa. China sees huge opportunities to see a more prosperous global south, to not only buy Chinese products and be a part of the Chinese market, but also to ensure that there is an advancement of these productive forces, both for itself and for them, because that leads to just more and more money and more development. And that only leads to more and more opportunities, which can further China's goals and then can further that country's goals without China having to actually do anything about those countries' goals. If that country has the goal to get more prosperous, to develop, to raise the standard of living, then China is willing to be a partner in that because it helps China. And of course, we have all these examples of when, yeah, it's not perfect. A lot of countries don't have a stable government like China's. They're not able to politically manage and navigate that kind of cooperation and sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes China it doesn't have the most perfect. Not all of its companies are going to do 100% things right. That's business. This isn't a perfect and pure world, but overall, China values strategic autonomy and values sovereignty, and if a country comes to it and values it too, then you're a good friend to China. But if you're like Europe, who is just willing to shoot yourself in all toes, on both feet, to amputate yourself slowly but surely, then China is going to have to be ready for that, because ultimately what happens is what we saw with the Netherlands taking over a Chinese tech company, what we see with the EU constantly threatening sanctions and tariffs and export restrictions and just copying the US's policies. China has to unfortunately prepare for an economic war on that front, and that's not pretty for Europe and the West. So that's I think the overall lesson here is that Europe has every opportunity. Same with Russia. I mean, Russia is not looking to dominate Europe. Putin just said he's willing to put in writing tomorrow that Russia will never invade Europe, but it's not going to. It wants real economic relations, not sanctions. It wants to be able to trade again. It doesn't want its pipelines blown up. This is just in some ways common sense, but of course European leaders, they're not working on common sense or their own interests. They're working on forwarding careers by being loyal servants to Washington.
I wonder, I'm not asking, I'm just wondering how much of Europe's vassalage is owed to the fact that it's occupied by the U.S. military-industrial complex, that there are U.S. bases all over Europe. To what extent would Europe be more willing to have an alternative international framework if it wasn't occupied by the U.S. empire? But I'm actually want to ask a different question. I'll just leave that floating out there for people. The United States and its corporate media proxies, who are owned by the same rich billionaires and corporations that own our politicians, like to frame China as a violator of human rights. You went to Xinjiang. So what did you see? What are your thoughts on China's treatments of its minorities and those practicing Islam in China?
Well, this is an interesting one, because when it comes to Xinjiang, the level of discrepancy, especially since October 7, 2023, especially since we had this horrific genocide in that part of the world where there's a high concentration of both Muslims, of Arabs, of various nationalities that make up what many Westerners call the Muslim world, but what really is a part of West Asia and Central Asia, which has just been subject to the most horrific war crimes by the U.S. and Europe. The discrepancy between reality and myth only is magnified, because in Xinjiang there's nothing like this. And this is what's so interesting is I went to the police academy and there's a museum there that shows the 16-year battle that China had. I think it was between 1990 and 2016, with some really horrific and gruesome attacks. I mean, they had all these weapons that they had collected, a lot of old, Soviet weapons, a lot of what the Mujahideen was using in Afghanistan during the proxy war, a lot of these weapons that ended up in the hands of these kind of forces. They had a huge pile of them. They had, panels describing each attack with pictures and images of what happened. And it was really horrific, because we're talking about people being stabbed and shot in public places in Xinjiang and in other parts of China. And in that sense, China had to respond to this, because it was a worldwide problem that was that was dictated by and really it was a product of U.S. foreign policy, a deliberate policy. I was just covering this on my show. There was just a shooting in Washington, D.C. of two National Guards members by someone connected to the CIA in Afghanistan, and he was fighting for the CIA, committing horrific crimes, and then he was given asylum and commits a horrific crime in the United States. I mean, this is the policy that the U.S. has been conducting for decades and decades and decades, dating all the way back to the 1970s, and China had to deal with it too because it shares a border with many countries, including Afghanistan, which had this problem, and so they had to take care of it, and they did so with a combination of methods. They did so with, of course, criminal justice. They had to punish the people who committed these horrific crimes, but with an eye toward actually rehabilitating them. Not like the U.S. prison system, which says, we'll rehabilitate you, but throw you in an 8x11 cell, or even worse, throw you in terrible conditions, with just simply punishment at heart, to just discipline the poorest of people in the harshest of ways, which only creates more mental health issues, more problems, more violence. That's what the prison system does, more death. In the U.S., that's what happens. But in China, what they did was they said, okay, well, how do we get people like this to not embrace the kind of ideology that they were presented with? And so that's what China has been doing for many, many years in Xinjiang, and it's worked. Because it ended at 2016, and since 2016, there hasn't been a single attack similar, and it's not because there's this police state in Xinjiang. When I've traveled there, it's nothing of the sort. There are people doing business. There are people living normal lives. There are people constantly. They're able to pray at their mosques. There's mosques everywhere. They're able to practice their religion. That's not what is at play here. What people in that part of China, like most of China, are most interested in is making more money, living a better life, being able to take advantage of the fruits of China's economic growth and development, and to advance themselves, to live better, and to be part of that. And so this is what is so interesting now, is that you don't really have that talked about as much, because China's done a really good job of not only taking care of the issues that brought about those attacks, but now, because it's blowback in a sense, now that the U.S. spent years from 2017 to into the Biden era, 2021, 2022-ish, before Ukraine and then Gaza just completely preoccupied the U.S. war propaganda machine, there was that 5-year period of Xinjiang, human rights abuses. China is, genociding their culture, genociding the people, then it was genociding the culture. First it was concentration camps, and then into genocide. And then there was so many people, not just myself, that were blowing open the reality that there was a lot of groups the U.S. was funding through the National Endowment for Democracy to promote this line inside of the United States and, of course, in the rest of the West. And then suddenly, you don't hear about it anymore because the U.S. is far too preoccupied in the horrific quagmires that it brought about against Russia and then, of course, Palestine. And now you don't hear about it anymore because a lot of people have traveled to Xinjiang and have showed that that's not true. It's just not what happens. I went to a Hui mosque in Xinjiang and talked to the imam and went to prayer, and there was nobody there saying they couldn't practice what they were doing. This is, and even the Hui Muslim population, the ethnic group, they've been targeted as victims of Chinese oppression during this period. So what we are seeing is that the narrative has been completely and utterly discredited, both by the U.S.'s own behavior and then, of course, by China's ability to actually take advantage. It's become a huge business hotspot. A lot of that is from China's own doing and preferences, independent of the U.S.'s aggression and propaganda machine. But it helped. It certainly helped. Xinjiang is being misunderstood makes it even that much more attractive. And so now it is more likely to accomplish its economic goals of not only bringing itself out of extreme poverty, which it did in 2020, but to then become this even more prosperous and even more interconnected part of China than it ever has been as a region of China that has many challenges, not least major areas of desertification, major areas, weather that's just absolutely, if you've been there in the wintertime, if you've seen the temperatures, there's so many challenges that that part of China has, environmentally even, but more likely to overcome those, and they are overcoming those. And, in some ways, the U.S. has played a role in that. And ultimately, that's kind of the scenario that we are seeing play out.
That's a fascinating take. Yeah, Urumqi is really quite developed now, and it's like pretty much any other city in China. When you go there at night, even the light show that is now China is so famous for. We have very little time, so if you could just keep this last question short, I had to cut a lot of questions because you're so thorough in your answers, sir. And just in terms of regular Americans, right? Like, what should regular Americans know about China that U.S. media kind of keeps from them? What would you like more Americans to know about China if you could just tell them one or two things about what China is actually like?
Well, I would say that China is a country that has a rich history, one that is really marked by a lot of suffering and struggle. A lot of heroic struggle, a lot of struggle that we need to learn about in order to understand why China is the way it is today, why it has adopted socialism with Chinese characteristics, why it is so much about non-interference, and why it is so much against war, why it pushes peace at all costs, why it prioritizes its development like it does. This history, I would say, is something that people need to understand when they start lecturing China and they start saying, why isn't China doing everything that we want it to do? You just got to understand that China has been through its own kind of genocide. It's been through a century of humiliation. It's only 70 plus years into a process that has already brought a miraculous economic development trajectory and reality, and is really the engine of the most progressive developments that we have in the world. And so in that, I just want people to know that that history is really important. They should study it, and then they should go there to see why China is the way that it is, and why China adheres to the principles it does, and why China develops the way that it does. So you can better understand it for yourself rather than listen to, talking heads in the West who simply seek to distort and make people believe that China is some kind of evil force that must be destroyed. Ultimately, once you do those things, then the reality of the situation just becomes more clear.
Thank you so much for your time, Danny Haiphong.
Appreciate it. It was great.